Continuing this three-part series on the offices of the Messiah. Last week we saw Jesus as the ultimate prophet. Today we are looking at Psalm 110:4 to see Jesus as the ultimate high priest. And then next week we will see Jesus as the ultimate king. And that'll leave us Christmas Eve for, of course, a message about angels and shepherds and all of that that I know you love to hear. By way of introduction, you probably already know that I am not, nor have I ever been, a priest, right? I'm not. But from time to time, those in the community confuse my title, pastor, with that with which they are more familiar. On several occasions, I have been called father, which, is fine. I take no offense. Hard to when people are trying to be respectful, and they're doing it in the way that they are accustomed to, the way that they know how. I chuckle, but it's very good-natured. Which makes me think the term pastor in English first arrived in the 14th century, borrowed from French, which had borrowed it from Latin. In all three languages, it's pronounced basically the same and holds the same meaning, shepherd. In the context, of course, of the church, it's not a shepherd of sheep, but a shepherd of souls, a guide and a protector of the flock of fellow disciples. The term priest comes from Old English by way of Old High German, which had borrowed it from Latin, which had taken it from Greek. And the original Greek is presbyteros. It eventually becomes priest in English. It's a bit of a journey of pronunciation, but it's the same word. It originally was used in the New Testament by Paul to refer to those those chosen for local church leadership, that is, elders, which in church history, as that unfolds, will become the title of the office that is above the deacon but below the bishop, becomes known as the priest. Now, the nerdiness of word origins aside, and frankly, I have to like that subject at least a little bit, given how deeply it was woven into the Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, who was a prodigious expert of word origins. So again, as a true Tolkien fan, I have to care about where words come from. When we call someone a pastor, we're describing what he or she does, the task given to us. When calling someone a priest, the word's origin points to that position occupied by the person given the task, at least in English. Now, that was a long way to say that today we're going to be talking about Jesus' role as the Messiah of being the final and greatest priest, which is not the same task of shepherding as a pastor. Of course, he is the good shepherd, so he'd be the best pastor too, but we're not talking about that today. Nor are we talking about the position within the church which Jesus occupies, because certainly, Jesus would outrank a bishop and a cardinal and a pope and whatever else, a patriarch, whatever else you want to call them. So it's not that either. Rather, when we talk about priest, we must look back further, back to the law of Moses, to the priesthood of Aaron and the Levites. For it is this priesthood, not the one that we're more familiar with, whose work and purpose Jesus fulfilled and brought to a close by being its last and greatest example. So let's take a look at Psalm 110, Verse 4. It says this: "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind." Now, there have been many men and women through the millennia of human history who have attempted to fulfill a particular role or an archetype of some lofty dimension. For example, both Alexander the Great and Caesar Augustus were eager to be viewed by their subjects as divine. So they embraced the symbolism and the pageantry of the people's religious expectations. When he was in Egypt, Alexander the Great did the things that a divine person in the Egyptian religion would be expected. And then when he was in Babylon, he did those. He did whatever the people needed to see him in that light. Later on, Napoleon would say, I can do this too, and he crowned himself, hoping to be viewed as the new Caesar. Similar lofty claims to unparalleled greatness have been made by any number of actors and athletes and inventors, businessmen, explorers, on and on. If there is a pedestal out there, there's somebody trying to stand on it, even if staying up on that pedestal is impossible. So how did Jesus, in his role as Messiah, come across the idea of being the greatest example to Israel, and hence to the rest of the world, of the role of prophet, priest, and king? That's a high bar, isn't it? What was it, a spur of the moment kind of thing? Certainly not, as we've seen in our text this morning. It was the plan of God, one that was established centuries before the advent of Jesus. Jesus knew exactly what role he was to play in the coming showdown against sin and death. And once this plan was established, there was no turning back, no second thoughts from God. This was the way to save humanity, and Jesus was the person to carry it out. So God has sworn and will not change his mind. It's also worth noting for us here that this plan of God involving the Messiah is the final stage in his redemptive program. Everything that happens after the Messiah fulfills this role will be because of that purposeful decision by God to take this step. So this moment in history when Jesus fulfills the roles of prophet, priest, and king by his life, death, and resurrection will be the hinge point on which all of history will pivot, both before and after. So God has sworn, and he will not change his mind about what? You are a priest forever. As I mentioned in the opening, Jesus is not a priest like a Catholic or Orthodox priest. That title comes from Greek presbyteros. Jesus is a priest with respect to Israel. The covenants of Abraham, the covenant of Moses, and of course the law. In the Septuagint of this verse, that's the Greek translation made before the time of Christ of Psalm 110:4, the Greek word is hierus, not presbyteros, hierus. It's a very different word, and that same word is used by the author of Hebrews that we quoted this morning and read it, when he uses this verse and talks about this priesthood of Jesus. This type of priest is the kind that offers blood sacrifices, the kind that performs sacred rituals. In the ancient world, every religion had priests who offered sacrifices of some kind to the gods. In each of these cultures and religions, there were rules, sometimes written down, sometimes unwritten rules, about who could become a priest. Most of them agreed that it was a role only for men, but others allowed priestesses. Most of these priests were connected to the ruler of their tribe or their kingdom, either by blood because they were a relative or by mutual self-interest. In that sense, Israel was no different. Its priests had two classes. They had rules. These were all descended from Moses' brother Aaron, who performed the most important priestly functions in the Mosaic system, or they were those who were descended from the entire tribe of Levi, who fulfilled for want of a better way to describe it, a support role in and around the temple. They were certainly far more numerous, the Levites, than the descendants of Aaron, because that was just one family. And they were responsible for much of the day-to-day interactions with the people. When it comes to spiritual matters, people normally are dealing with a Levite because there's a lot more of them. As our reading this morning from Hebrews emphasized, Jesus was not a part of either of those lineages. When God chose Mary to bear the Messiah, the choice was certainly deliberate. She, along with Joseph, were the perfect choices for who the Messiah needed to be as a future king, with the right to sit upon the vacant throne of David. Of course, we'll be dealing with that next week. However, Jesus' human ancestry through Mary and Joseph did not include any priestly connection. To be the heir of David meant foregoing a priestly path. Not that this was a surprise. Israel had never had a combo priest-king before, nor had they had any real need for one until now. Which is why Psalm 110 tells us that God declared that the Messiah would be a priest. The decision to limit the priesthood to Aaron's and Levi's descendants was made by God, after all, right? That was his decision. And if anyone was going to alter the arrangement, it would have to be God himself. God made that requirement. God can set it aside. And that's just what God decided to do. Change or adapt or modify or whatever you want to call it, his covenant with Israel by fulfilling it this way. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Which brings us to Melchizedek, an obscure person mentioned briefly in Genesis' account of the life of the patriarch Abraham. If you read Genesis, one would be unlikely to expect later commentators to make much of a deal out of the chapter where Abraham shows deference to Melchizedek. But once David wrote in this psalm that God had plans to bring forth a priest like Melchizedek had once been, now we need to sit up and take notice. What's going on here? What does this mean? Which is what the author of Hebrews does. He quotes from this verse over and over again in chapters 5 through 7 of the book of Hebrews. Actually, 6 different times in those 3 chapters, he quotes this verse as he unfolds his explanation as to why Jesus is the ultimate high priest. I won't try to sum up that full discussion here. I'm not going to try to tell you what 3 chapters in the book of Hebrews has to say. We read a big portion of it, but there's a much more that explains this role of priest in great detail. If you're curious about it, read those chapters, think on them, ask me questions if you need to, because that is where our best and fullest explanation comes from. For our purposes, it will suffice to say that Melchizedek was not a part of God's unfolding covenantal plan with Abraham. At least not directly, for they were neither kin nor very much interconnected in Abraham's story, except for that one occasion. If they interacted beyond that, we don't know about it. It's just that one time. But note, God chose to involve Melchizedek, a man with whom God had a relationship that had been established outside of the Genesis narrative. When he comes into the story in Genesis, he's already a priest of the Most High God. He's already in relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had made him a priest. Coincidentally and symbolically, in the city that would at some point in the future be called Jerusalem. And God chose to have Abraham recognize the authority of this man as a priest of the Lord Most High. Now, God didn't need a precedent like this to make his Messiah the ultimate priest. I mean, the Messiah is unique, right? There's only one of those. So he could have transcended the normal rules and applied them to this particular instance. But God chose to do it this way. He chose to lay this groundwork at the very beginning of the story of Israel, during the life of Abraham, so that he could later take that one loose thread from the story of Genesis and say, you know what? Here it's where it fits in. Put it into the awe-inspiring story of the advent of the long-awaited Savior of God's people. Now, we already know the story of Jesus that we celebrate at Christmas. We know it's unique, right? The angels, the shepherds, the wise men in our nativity sets, they remind us every year of how unique and special and amazing this moment in time is. By adding the title of priest to Jesus' overflowing resume, right? I mean, this guy, I don't know how he's fitting his resume on just one sheet of paper. There's a lot of stuff on it. God once again expands the marvel that we feel when we contemplate this amazing grace. Never before had there been the combination of any of these three, prophet, priest, and king. And Jesus is all three. And as priest, not only will he be the greatest priest ever, but he will be offering himself as the spotless lamb upon the sacrificial altar. One more sacrifice, perfect in its power. Three thoughts for you to take away from this. Number one, the choice to make the Messiah a priest was God's purposeful design. This is what God wanted. He saw this as the perfect path. Secondly, this contradicted the law of Moses, but God, as its author, could change it. And he had created the precedent to do so long before Moses, of course, with Melchizedek. Thirdly, the kind of priest that Jesus became followed after Melchizedek, but he would go far beyond him. For Jesus would be the perfect priest, offering the perfect sacrifice once for all.